Good afternoon, friends and fellow Rotarians. My name is Mina Worthington. I'm the President and CEO of Celerity Credit Union and a Rotary Board member. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker this week, Michael Daigneault. Michael Daigneault is the CEO and co-founder of Quantum Governance. Michael has over 30 years of experience as a consultant and a facilitator. He's an expert on topics such as governance, ethics, strategic planning, does this for businesses, nonprofits, associations, and governmental entities. Michael is a three-time graduate of Georgetown University. He holds a BA from the College of Philosophy, a JD from the Law Center, as well as a master's degree in law from the Law Center. In fact, Michael is one of the first persons to graduate from the Law Center with a master's in law that has a concentration in legal ethics and professional responsibility. Today, we welcome Michael virtually to Yakima, where he will share his 6 best practices you need to know about nonprofit governance and leadership. Thank you and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Daigneault. I'm the CEO and founder of Quantum Governance L3C, and I've been invited by one of your colleagues, Mina Worthington, to talk to you a little bit about the notion of nonprofit governance and leadership. I'm very pleased to be talking with the members of the Rotary Club of Downtown Yakima, and I want to thank you all for your service to your community. I'm familiar with Rotary clubs, and I think the work that you do is terrific, so thank you for what you do. What Mina asked me to do is just do about a 20 or so minute discussion with you about some of the core governance and leadership principles for a nonprofit organization. So I've entitled this 6 best practices you need to know about nonprofit governance and leadership. But of course, I'm mindful of the age that we're in. And what I would say is this: in times of crisis like now, when people are feeling frightened and uncertain, governance and leadership don't just matter, they matter exponentially more. So I think this talk, albeit I won't be talking a great deal about the crisis, I think is timely and is hopefully helpful to you and your colleagues in leading nonprofits and participating in various nonprofit activities in your community. So let's get started. Just a brief couple of extra tidbits about quantum governance. We're an L3C, which is a limited liability, low profit organization dedicated to the public good. It's a mouthful, I know. But the organization is really not a for-profit consulting practice. Indeed, we're not a nonprofit either. We're a hybrid in between the two, and we exist in a good number of states. And our focus is on working with leaders of nonprofit institutions and people in the business community who want to participate in nonprofits to help them govern and lead, strategically plan, and indeed fundraise more effectively for their organizations. We do this in a variety of ways. You can see on the slide here, governance consulting, advice, and counsel. We do lots of presentations, workshops, and seminars. In addition to that, we often lead a lot of strategic planning discussions and retreats, and we also do assessments of boards, assessments of senior leadership teams, and we do lots of research and knowledge building in the nonprofit and indeed in the credit union field as well, where Mina is affiliated with. We have many years of experience in working with various different types of nonprofit institutions, and we tend to work at the leadership levels of institutions. The challenge as I see it right now for many organizations, particularly when things are challenging, is that governance and leadership of many nonprofits is frankly not as effective as it should be, as it needs to be. Indeed, unfortunately, in our work with nonprofits around the country, and we worked in just about all 50 states, indeed around the world, a number of nonprofit boards or nonprofit leadership teams we found to be dysfunctional. They might or might not even understand the basic elements of what is their role as a nonprofit board, as a nonprofit board member, or what the role of fundamental committees or even the officers of the board are. And this can really hinder them in doing an effective job. A good number, however, I think are more effective than that, but let's call them functional. They know the basics, they know the elements of what they're supposed to be doing, they meet on a regular basis, but we can ask the question of just how much value are they really adding to the institution? This is assuming that they have, let's say, an executive director or a CEO and a staff. Sometimes there's a constructive partnership and they work really well together, and both the board and the staff are contributing a lot of value. But sometimes, unfortunately, the board is there as a kind of a rubber stamp to some of the things that the staff is doing. And so what we like to do is try to get organizations obviously out of the dysfunctional and functional end of the spectrum, more into the responsible or exceptional end of the spectrum. And what might that look like? Well, as you go from functional to responsible, one of the criteria that we look for is a board of directors and indeed a senior team of a nonprofit that is consciously aware of the leadership role that board and board members have to play. And they start asking them some key questions like, how can our board be more effective? How can our committees be more effective? How can we more effectively fundraise, for example? How can we more effectively carry out the mission of our organization? And indeed, some organizations, even though they are not perfect at the responsible level, they put themselves into a situation where they have a number of committees that are responsible for doing some important elements of the board's work, and sometimes even the organization's work. And so they're doing a good, solid job and being as responsible and as conscious and as thoughtful about leading as possible, but they're not perhaps all the way there. And then there are some nonprofits with leadership teams, indeed boards of directors and the senior leadership teams that they work with that are really at the exceptional level. They've worked hard, they have assessed themselves, they've looked at their committees, they've written down indeed the types of things that their various different committees should do in a charter. They have job descriptions, not only for the board members, but they have job descriptions for the officers of the board. Indeed, they often have a board policy manual, which is not just, let's say, an oversight of the policies of the nonprofit overall, but the governance and leadership policies of the organization aggregated together. Our role, we see at Quantum Governance, and something we encourage each of you and each of the nonprofit organizations you may or may not be affiliated with at this time, but could be affiliated with in the future, is to always try to go to the exceptional end of the spectrum, to try to help the workings of the organization, the governance of the organization, the leadership of the organization to be as responsible, indeed, if not as exceptional as possible. Common challenges that we see all the time. Well, unfortunately, we'll see organizations that are kind of stuck. On the left-hand side here, the same way of thinking. And if you get the same way of thinking, you sometimes will get the same results. They'll get stuck in one mode of thought. This can happen, for example, with a board, who the board might say, well, the only reason we exist as a board is financial accountability. Or the only reason we have a board, some senior staffs might say, is well, they help us raise money. If you get stuck in one mode of thought like that and pigeonhole the group, sometimes that can create a more limited role and indeed more limited results for the board and for the leadership overall. Some groups are weak in accountability. Yes, volunteers, but nonetheless, even though people are volunteers, we want to hold people accountable for whatever their promises are. Some groups, unfortunately, there's not a clear understanding of the board members' roles and responsibilities. Indeed, even for small, mid-sized, and some of the largest nonprofits that we've worked with, and we've worked with nonprofits with assets in the many, many billions of dollars, even though they're nonprofits, sometimes the board members and even the senior team members from staff that are working with them are not really clear on the roles and responsibilities of the board. Some groups will not focus consistently on strategic questions, ideas, and issues. Sometimes also there can be an insufficient amount of board rejuvenation, of creating kind of new ideas, new blood, bringing new people into the mix. There has to be a balance there, of course. You don't want to turn over the whole board all at one time, but nor do you want everyone on the board to be stuck in the same role, in the same seat for many, many, many decades without any new folks coming into the board. There can be, at times, a lack of genuine engagement, people not showing up for board members, people not participating in committee meetings. This is always a danger sign. Sometimes there's a lack of learning, ongoing learning. I've interviewed lots of board members, indeed thousands of board members, and sometimes I've asked them, what have you learned recently about the organization, about your role? And some of them are wonderful. It's, oh, I've learned all these kinds of new things and we're really progressing and this is what we're doing. But I've also had people respond, I haven't learned anything new in the last 3-4 years. That's a real red flag. Sometimes there's an assumption, as we say in the box here in the middle of this slide, if the numbers look good, if the fundraising has been successful, or the capital campaign has been successful, or the budget is balanced, well, we must be governing well because the numbers look good. Well, sometimes the numbers look good and the governance is effective, but sometimes the numbers look good and the governance is still ineffective. So you have to be careful not to be lulled into a sense of complacency for that. There can be an imbalance of authority. You can have a chairman for life. You can have a CEO for life. Or you can have one or more people have an undue amount of authority. Have to be careful about that. Remember, boards are collective decision-making bodies. And many of you are, of course, familiar with the fact that there can be ineffective board meetings. And one of the The indicators of ineffective board meetings is that people are perhaps not asking the really hard, the really central questions. So these are just examples of some of the common governance challenges that we've seen from organizations of all different sizes from all over the country. So let's look at some of the core 6 principles that I think are really important and that are the central features of this particular talk. And that is, 1, what is governance? What do we mean by this notion of governance? Well, governance for quantum is actually a kind of a 2-part idea. One part is that it's about formal aspects, the steering, the directing, the policy setting, kind of the formal aspects of governance itself. But there's also the informal side, the influential or persuasive side that board members and boards as a whole often play. Now, clearly being on a board, you're put in a position of authority, but it's both the formal and the informal that are important. And indeed, a lot of regulatory schemes, a lot of formal legal schemes, things like that, are all about the formal aspects, the steering, the directing, the policy setting. But our experience is that the influential or persuasive side of things often is 90–95% of what board members are doing on a regular basis. So pay attention to the culture, therefore, of the board, how people communicate with each other, the web of relationships, the dynamics on the board. Governance, as such, deals with a kind of a legitimate distribution of authority, call it formal and informal, throughout a system. It could be a country, it could be a corporation, or it can be a nonprofit. What are the core responsibilities of a nonprofit board? This is actually a question in a lot of interactive sessions that we ask people, and people really struggle with this particular question. So at the center of this particular diagram, I want to suggest to you that at the center of the core responsibilities of a nonprofit board are to govern and lead an organization. Now, executive directors, CEOs of nonprofits could say, hey, wait a minute, what about us? What'd you hire us for? Didn't you hire us to lead the organization? The answer is yes. The answer is I think in some ways the boards and the executive directors or CEOs, using those 2 terms synonymously, govern in constructive partnership with each other. And it isn't an either or situation, but it's an and. It's working in constructive partnership with each other that they really lead the organization. Therefore, governance and leadership, even though the board is ultimately responsible, governance also entails not only the board, but the CEO and senior team, or the ED and the senior team of the nonprofit, the committees of the nonprofit, and yes, indeed, sometimes the membership of the nonprofit and other key stakeholders. What are those key responsibilities that a board often has to play in a nonprofit? Well, certainly CEO or ED support and oversight. The choice of an executive director of a nonprofit is often the most important decision that a board makes, but supporting them, cheerleading them, but yes, also overseeing them, and on a regular basis giving them feedback as to their performance, really important. Also, moving around the clock here, the performance and results of the nonprofit itself. Often you spend a lot of time in board meetings on the performance and results of the organization. How you measure the performance and the results of the organization seems like such an easy question to ask. This is one of the most conceptually difficult things to actually figure out. What is it we should be measuring? What are positive results? How do we interpret those results? What are the things that we should really be looking at that are either direct or indirect indicators that we're making a real difference? In addition to that, strategic thinking, learning, and planning. And these words are to a certain extent purposely put in that order, and that is thinking strategically, and as a result of that strategic thought, learning on a regular basis about key strategic questions or key strategic issues, constantly learning about new strategic things, and then planning strategically. So a lot of people will say, well, you know, the board in conjunction with the CEO and the senior team, our job is the strategic plan. Yes, it is. But the real sometimes challenge is to think strategically and learn on a regular basis strategically, and then do the planning on an ongoing basis in an effective way. Certainly oversight over the budget and the resources of the organization, a fundamental role of the board. Constituent and community outreach, most people will nod their head and say, yeah, of course, constituent and community outreach. This is kind of an ambassadorial role of the board. It may be much more important than just showing up to board meetings, but working with staff, working with the ED, working with the organization and finding ways to reach out to new communities, new constituencies, new stakeholders for the organization, a very important role the board can take. Some boards do this very, very well and very aggressively, and some boards don't do it at all. And so it's one thing I think you should think about. And then last, but certainly not least, the stewardship, the ethics, the financial integrity of the organization, making sure that the numbers are right, making sure that the finances are done on a timely basis, making sure that the money is spent in ways that are promised. So when we look at and think about at Quantum, the kind of bundle of activities, and there's all different kinds of lists that you can look at, but when we look at the bundle of activities that nonprofits are responsible for, this is one way of framing those key responsibilities of the ultimate board member or volunteer leaders of a nonprofit. Now, we can also look at the notion of leadership from the role of board officers. And you could say, well, hey, listen, we've had nonprofits in the United States since the Mayflower Compact. We all know what the chair, the vice chair, and the secretary treasurer do. Well, what I'd love to suggest to you is these roles have actually evolved over the years. The chair a little bit less so, but the other ones, I think a great deal more so. And so I'd love to at least somewhat plant some seeds concerning the more progressive, more active role that some of these board officers are currently playing. One, the chair not only facilitating board meetings, not only working with the ED to come up with the agenda of board meetings, but the chair really actively managing, not the nonprofit, not the entire organization, but managing the board manager in chief. So who is appointed to which committees? Are the committees meeting on a regular basis? Are the board meetings effective? Do we have really good agendas? Do we have the right committees in place, and do we have the right people in the right seats on the committees? Indeed, do we have the right people in the right seats on the board, et cetera, et cetera? The chair can be an active manager-in-chief of the board. The vice chair. Well, the vice chair often is in a situation, not universally, but often a chair-elect or someone who could likely become the chair if things work out. If that's the case, the chair can really fulfill a really unique and important role in today's day and age, and that is as a board learner-in-chief. They have to be learning to make sure they could be a really effective chair, at least in many circumstances. But rather than just keeping all that learning to themselves, they can be a catalyst for the learning of the entire board, indeed, the learning of the entire organization. And so we like to urge them to be a catalyst, to be constantly learning. Why? Because that constant learning also feeds the strategic discussions and the strategic ideas of the organization. Now, the secretary role, almost everyone universally will say, well, the secretary of the board, if you even have one, is, oh, well, they just take the minutes of meetings. Indeed, often it's a staff person that takes the minutes. But actually, we think that the secretary role is much more important than that. Indeed, the secretary can be the board builder in chief. Literally, think of the secretary as you might think of the chief governance officer of the organization. They're there to be the right-hand person to the chair of the board to help make sure that the board is as effective as possible. So do we have, again, the right committees? Do we have the right people in the right seats? Are our board meetings effective? Do we do regular assessments of our board? How do we know we're doing a good job as a board? Do we have the right information? Do we even have the right orientation and educational programs for our board members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So the secretary, yes, is responsible for ensuring that minutes are taken at meetings, but 100 other things as well. Last but not least is the treasurer. And for some organizations that have internal financial talent, you think, well, what do we need a board treasurer for? Well, one of the reasons I think you need a treasurer for is the treasurer helps to translate the financials to some people on the board who might not have as much financial experience as, let's say, financial professionals. And so the treasurer can be a board translator in chief, making sure that there's an understanding of what the financials are, how often they're done in a regular basis, the clarity of them, and making sure that they're in the form, and not only that the staff understands them, but that the board members understand them, and that essentially the key ideas, the key implications of those financials are translated on a regular basis for their fellow board members, so that fellow board members truly understand the nitty-gritty of some of the key implications of the financials, so they can then make good decisions based on those financials. One other way of kind of understanding the governance of a nonprofit is a way that Ram Charan, who wrote a book called Boards That Lead, said for-profit as well as nonprofit boards some years ago, and that is you can look at it as two overlapping circles. The board is responsible for some things in a leadership capacity. They're the leader, they're the final decision maker, they're responsible for certain things, the leadership role of the board. For example, the choice of the executive director. That's the board's role. It's the board's job, and no one but the board's job. Other people can help, but it's really the board's decision. Then there are situations, a lot of things that are traditionally delegated and formally delegated to the CEO or ED, and of course the staff that works at the nonprofit, sometimes also consultants or other suppliers and vendors. Okay? So these are delegated things. And then in the middle, there are things where I think it's most helpful to frame it in terms of, here's a partnership. Let's look at these things where it's appropriate for the board and the CEO to partner together, to figure out how we do this and how we do this best, and then to actually execute on that sometimes in the best way. A classic example, partnership area might be What should our strategic vision, mission, and key strategic goals be? You don't want to do that just with the board. You don't want to do that just the CEO, ED, or the senior staff. You want to do that in a constructive partnership between the board and the senior staff. So what should our strategy be? Or who's responsible for fundraising? Well, I think in the vast majority of nonprofits, the answer is not just the board or just the staff. The answer is the board and staff work in constructive partnership with each other. Another one would be, who's responsible for the agenda at board meetings? Is it just the board chair or is it just the executive director? Our answer would be it's both, working in constructive partnership with each other. So this partnership area is a really critical area, but it can be an area where there's sometimes some misunderstandings, and therefore we urge you to actively negotiate in the partnership area who's responsible for what, when, and where. One of the key things that is probably the biggest development, at least in the last decade or so in my experience in the nonprofit community, is the development of something that's often called governance committees. Some people call it a governance and nominations committee to make it really clear about what their scope of responsibilities are. But this is a board level committee in a nonprofit whose focus is on making sure that the board is governing and leading as effectively as possible in constructive partnership with the CEO or ED and staff. Now, the history of this is that a lot of people have nominations committee. Nominations committee job largely fill board openings when they occur. Often, though, nominations committees come into existence and then they go out of existence. And there isn't a lot of continuity there. And there can be big gaps between when one exists and another exists and the like. And their scope is, as you can see, very, very limited. Now, some people have said, well, that's not quite enough. We need to have a board development committee. Their job is to fill board openings, certainly. But in addition to that, to orient board members as they're coming onto the board, and perhaps even to do ongoing education and development for board members over time. So there's this educational component too, hence a board development committee, not to be confused with a fundraising and development committee. But what's really happened in the recent decade or so is the explosion of governance, or as I said before, governance and nominations committees, where they do all of the things above. But in addition to that, they pay close attention to board roles and responsibilities. They actually write job descriptions of the board members, of the officers, and things like that. They pay attention to what those responsibilities are, and they're memorialized. What should the ideal composition of our board be? What would our ideal board look like? Who do we want on our board? What are the kinds of skills? Indeed, in addition to skills, what are the kinds of attributes that we want people to have on our board? What type of board knowledge do people have to have? What kind of knowledge do they have already? And maybe what gaps might we have? What do we need to know on our board to do our jobs as effectively as possible? Is our governance system as itself effective? So one of the things that governance and nominations committees do will now regularly assess the board. And there's all kinds of assessment tools for the board as a whole to figure out whether or not it is doing an effective job. Last but not least is the notion of board leadership. And in this one, this would be, how do we make sure we have a succession plan for the chair, the vice chair, the secretary, the treasurer, and or even in this general notion of leadership here, making sure that we have a really good succession plan for our CEO, the one employee of the board, to make sure that we're paying attention and have a really good succession plan for that person. And you need to have that kind of succession plan at all times. So governance committees are a really important development for nonprofits, and we urge all nonprofits to strongly consider having one. Last but not least, in these kind of 6 areas is the elements of strategic planning. A lot of times there's confusion as to the role of the board, the role of staff, and what are the elements of strategic planning. Even when someone says strategic planning, people may think of different things when we say strategic planning. When we think of the notion of strategic planning, we're thinking here on this slide, you see the blue boxes. There are 6 core components that the board and management, the board and let's say the ED and senior staff, are responsible for ensuring that they craft and that they agree on. What's the vision of the nonprofit? What's the mission of the nonprofit? And vision and mission are different. Vision being what's the difference we're trying to make in the world external to our organization. Okay? How are we trying to make the world a better place as opposed to the mission? These are the things that we do in order to achieve that vision. The vision of the American Hospital Association is healthy communities. The mission of the American Hospital Association, hypothetically speaking, is to work with member hospitals, hospices, and other healthcare institutions to provide high quality, accessible healthcare in order to create healthy communities, the vision. What are the values or the core cultural components that we're going to have in carrying out this vision and mission? And then what are our, 3 to 5 core strategic goals that we're really trying to accomplish, our priorities? This is not 47 strategic goals. You can't chase 47 rabbits and catch any rabbits. What are the 3 to 5 core strategic goals that we're going to prioritize right now? And then what are those objectives that we need to accomplish underneath those goals in order to make sure that we achieve those goals? And often there's a number, 2, 3, 4 objectives for each one of those strategic goals. And last but not least, how do we know we're successful in achieving those strategic objectives? There's often strategic metrics that are applied to those objectives. And they can be objective measures, they can be even subjective measures at times, but some type of agreed upon metrics between the senior staff and the board as to whether or not they've actually achieved the objectives and hence the goals and ultimately the vision, mission, values of the organization. The blue area here, constructive partnership, overlap between the board and management. The orange area, organizational work plans, sometimes business plans, annual plans. You can call it what you want, but this is developed and executed by management. It needs to be responsive to what's happening in the blue area. It needs to be responsive to the strategic planning goals, objectives, and metrics that the board and the senior team have agreed to. But in the orange area, this is what's done by management, as well as group or team or even committee work plans, ultimately all the way down to individual work plans, an individual work plan of the ED or of senior VPs of the organization if it has that kind of size, etc. Bottom line, the board and senior team, including the ED or CEO, work on the blue areas and agree on them collectively together. This is that overlap area. And then the staff, ED and senior staff and other members of the staff execute in the orange area. Sometimes there's other volunteers and the like that will help in the orange area, but they're still working on the execution or management end of things. So you have to keep your hats straight if you're wearing both a board hat and sometimes a volunteer hat. The element is if you do these well and they stay aligned, as this diagram suggests, you have a really good, effective, clearly thought through, agreed upon set of common strategic goals, objectives, and metrics that can help your nonprofit move forward. So what have we learned or what have we talked about? Governance is both formal and informal. Pay attention to both the formal and the informal sides of the equation. That it's the core responsibility of the board to govern, but indeed, even though it's the ultimate responsibility of the board to govern, they do so in constructive partnership with the CEO, with the committees, and sometimes even the members or other key stakeholders of the organization. The board officer roles have evolved. Don't stay stuck in the mud. Indeed, the board chair being an active manager of board operations, not just letting that be delegated to the ED or CEO, but the board chair takes an active role. It doesn't mean the board chair makes all the decisions because the board chair is one among many in the board role, but making sure that things are coordinated and moving forward. As well as, by the way, the vice chair, key, learner, okay, an educator on the board, the board secretary, making sure that the board is operating effectively, and the board treasurer, a critical translator of the financials to make sure everyone understands them. Yes, we think you, no matter what your size nonprofit is, should have some type of governance committee to make sure that your organization is being governed effectively on a regular basis, that boards lead in ultimate constructive partnership, at least successful boards lead in constructive partnership with the executive director, and strategy is set. You remember the blue areas in the chart. The strategy is set in constructive partnership between the board and the senior team in agreement and then executed traditionally by staff. Ensure, therefore, there is great strategic clarity and alignment in the overall scheme of things. Make sure that you're clear on what is our vision, what's our mission, what are our values, what key strategic goals do we have, what are the objectives we need to accomplish in order to accomplish those goals, and then how we're going to measure success. What are those key metrics of success? You do these things, and we think you can have a really effective governance and leadership system for your nonprofit. Whether it's in difficult times such as today or in normal times, these are the kinds of things that we think you can and should do to really have an effective leadership culture and an effective leadership team for your nonprofit. So to wrap up, I really want to thank you for all that you do. Thank you for participating in this particular video session here today. I appreciate your kind attention, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I do want to thank all of you, though, for your service. I know much of the work that you do is dedicated to improving your community, and I certainly appreciate that. I've seen the work of Rotaries around the country, and it is certainly good work, and it's very appreciated. And I also want to say thank you to Mina for the opportunity to address you. If any of you have any questions about anything that I've said or would like some additional information or materials, such as sample board member job descriptions or descriptions of committees or things like that, You can see the information here on this last slide. I and my team would be happy to send those to you. With that said, thank you for what you've already done. Thank you for what you've done here today, and thank you for what you will do. It's appreciated.